Disclaimer. I am a law student, and the legal information provided is not legal advice. For that, please hire an attorney. Hi! Let's begin with a hypothetical. Let's say that we have a gay man. Alright? Cisgender, assigned male at birth, got the penis and balls and everything. Alright? We got a gay guy. And let's say that this gay guy is, to not mince words, a rapist. Alright? And let's say that we have this gay guy who goes out and rapes over, or close to, 200 other cis men. Alright? He's gay. He specifically goes out and targets other gay men, or other men in general. Alright? And let's say that eventually this man is caught by police and went to trial and is convicted for those rapes. Hooray! Justice done. Or at least, I don't know if you believe in that. The justice system and police and all that is a whole nother conversation. But at least by most modern societal standards, justice is done. All right? And let's say that as a consequence, a lot of more conservative groups, which are, broadly speaking, anti-LGBT, start using this person as the basis to attack, broadly speaking, the entirety of the LGBT community, but in particular gay people. All right? And let's say that this group begins using this person in particular to say, you see, gay people are a threat to us. This is what we've been saying for so long. We've been fear-mongering. I mean, they might not say this explicitly. We've been fear-mongering against gay people, but that's because our beliefs are justified. That's because we know it can happen. We know it's conceivable that it can happen. And it did. Look. You have a gay man who committed over, like, close to 200 rapes against other men. So we need to do something, not only to punish this person in particular, but to punish the entirety of the community. We need to recognize that there is a threat that this community has unique to them in regards to sexual assault. Question. Are the concerns of these conservative groups in this hypothetical that by virtue of this man in particular's actions, that this is somehow representative of something within the larger LGBT community, and that therefore there needs to be additional actions taken regarding how to treat LGBT people more broadly? Hey everyone, that is a dark hypothetical. Fuck me. But yeah, welcome to the show. It's great to be here. By the way, in case you didn't notice, we have some new fancy animated assets. We got this. How do I do this? This fancy little thing here, and we have this thing here. That's cool. And obviously there was the intro stream. Yeah. Who are we talking about? Well, hey, why don't we, we can just go ahead and get right on into it. So I'll explain more about the hypothetical. There's a reason I brought it up in particular, but hey, look, it's everyone's favorite transmed. It's everyone's favorite transmed, Rose of Dawn. Hello there. Unfortunately, looks like I'll never be able to speak with her. In case people haven't seen, you should totally go see so basically her opinion of me is that apparently I'm incapable of having an honest discussion, which I find to be hilarious, but whatever. So Rose, if you happen to see this, then hi there. How's it going? I look forward to chatting someday, but I'm not gonna get too beat up over you not wanting to talk to me. But you put out something which I've been meaning to talk about this in particular, like this particular subject, right? Like in your particular thing, I mean, like other people talk about this too, right? Like Blair White did this bit, right? But like this idea that TERFs and similar people like to bring up with trans predators, right? Riley, why did you find the worst frames to pause on? Listen, it's right at the beginning of the video. It's literally just a second in. I don't know. That's not my fault. But yeah, so we're going to watch this video. Now, from what I understand, she's going to be talking about someone named, Barbie Kardashian. I've looked into it, and from what I can see, this person is about as bad as I expect that Rose is going to make her out to be. I haven't seen the particular arguments, but I did a lot of research in preparation for this. And yeah, we're going to go through, and I really want to just get down to the idea of like focusing on quote unquote trans predators. Amazing. Prediction, the non-zero anecdotes is data. Amazing. But yeah, and essentially what I want to do is I want to really explore like why people focus on X type of predator in general. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Rose, why don't you take it away for us?
Within the gender debate, the idea of self-ID, that is the choice to legally obtain recognition of your...
Want to go back to the beginning?
Of all the topics within the gender debate, the idea of self-ID, that is the choice to legally obtain recognition of your gender simply by self-declaration alone, is one of the most hotly contested and controversial subjects. It's something which I've talked at length about in previous videos, and it's something which I've been openly opposed to. Now, advocates of self-ID...
We'll talk about this more later, but yeah, I don't know. I'm interested in her arguments.
Would claim the system they propose is not one which is open to abuse, and that there is no one who would actually go out there and use these mechanisms as a way of being able to gain access to vulnerable people, particularly women. Now, absolutist positions like this are why the conversation has become so toxic. Now, recent attempts to bring some...
Hold on. All right, hold on. We have a really short straw man to address right at the onset. Wow, that was super fucking fast. We're immediately talking from the position of a straw man, right? Now, mind you, it's not that people cannot abuse these systems. And mind you, we already have self-ID systems. Like, for example, if you identify with a certain religion, then congratulations. Just by virtue of identifying with that religion, you get protections under law, right? Like, we have self-ID laws, right? The question isn't whether or not, like, they can't be abused at all. It's a question of, like, whether or not it's a reasonable fear, or, like, it's something that would be, like, an actual reasonable thing to happen often. Or whether or not we're really just talking about like one-off crazy-ass people who are otherwise still breaking the law, right? So yeah, when we're talking about taking advantage of self-ID and going into women's spaces, let's go ahead and just like get some really quick stuff out of the way. Are concerns of trans predators in bathrooms, changing rooms, etc. empirically valid, right? Like, are these fears reasonable, right? Like, yeah, like if you're able to pull like anecdotal one-off instances of like trans predators out of the air, but like, is this something that happens statistically significantly enough to be able to draw a conclusion, to like a statistically significant degree, that like a thing which causes these people to take advantage of these systems or of the self-ID laws is like the fact that they are trans, or the fact that, but for these laws existing, that they would not go out and otherwise rape these people or commit sexual assault, right? So let's start. In 2018, a study was published in the Journal of Sexuality Research and Social Policy with discussions on how, quote, legislations, regulations, litigation, and ballot propositions affecting public restroom access for transgender people increased drastically in the last 3 years, and how opponents of gender identity inclusive public accommodation non-discrimination laws often cite fear of safety and privacy violations in public restrooms if such laws are passed. While proponents argue that such laws are needed to protect transgender people and concerns regarding safety and privacy violations are unfounded, what they found was no empirical evidence that has been gathered to test such laws' effect. There's just none, right? Like, when we're talking about, like, fears of trans predators in women's spaces, like, there's no empirical evidence that's been gathered to be able to test this. All we have are, like, one-off bits of anecdotal data, right? And furthermore, the study provides evidence that fears of increased safety and privacy violations as a result of non-discrimination laws are not empirically grounded, right? Like, there's just no evidence for them at all. Additionally, according to RAINN, most rapes and sexual assaults, 8 out of 10, are committed by someone that victim knows, not random men and women claiming to be transgender going into bathrooms. Additionally, according to their analysis of rape and sexual assault in the U.S., 48% of the survivors were at home sleeping or performing another activity at home, 29% were traveling, running errands, etc., 12 were working, 7% were at school, and 5 are doing an unknown or other activity. Therefore, it can be inferred that rapes in the bathrooms are overall, like, just rare. And even then, it's not caused by trans people. Additionally, according to a report published in 2018 by the Human Rights Campaign, quote, researchers looked at the data from a survey of nearly 3,700 U.S. teens aged 13 to 17, and the study found that 36% of transgender and non-binary students with restricted bathroom or locker room access reported being sexually assaulted in the last 12 months, according to the May 6, 2019 CNN article. Of all the students surveyed, 1 out of every 4, or 25.9%, reported being a victim of sexual assault in the past year, right? Like, let's be clear. Not only, and then we can also add this statistic onto it. Additionally, according to the United States Department of Justice Bureau of Justice Statistics, the United States fucking government, trans people are roughly 10 times more likely to experience sexual assault in prisons than cis people, whereas non-heterosexual people are roughly 3 times more likely. This actually probably can go in another section, but it makes the argument just as much here. Additionally, according to a study conducted by the British National Centre for Social Research, a vast majority of cis women are not, in fact, concerned with which facilities transgender people use. They found that 72% of women said that they were either very or quite comfortable with a transgender woman using a female toilet. So the analysis is that, like, right off the bat, there's no empirical evidence to show that concerns about trans predators are rooted in anything except for discriminatory prejudices against trans people. In fact, most trans people likely have been victims of violence as a result of being forced in the bathrooms of their assigned gender at birth. And not only that, but the vast majority of women don't care about trans women in women's bathrooms, right? So, like, not only is this not an empirically valid, like, concern, like, there's not, like, any causal relationship between being trans and, like, committing acts of violence in, like, a woman's space against women or against cis women. But also, trans people are statistically the targets of violence in those kind of spaces. And also, most cis women just don't care. So, let's be clear. Like, yeah, you'll be able to find, like, one-off people who will fit this model. And I'm sure we're going to be getting into the name of the person, right? Who basically fits this model. But, like, let's be clear. There's no statistically significant relationship between their being trans and them being a rapist. Like, they're just a rapist or a sexual assault or just like a crazy person that happens to be trans. And, like, in case it's not apparent, actually, you know what? We're pretty early on, but I'm gonna talk about the hypothetical. People have been using this trope against minorities for years, right? People use this against gay people. In fact, just to be clear, the hypothetical I constructed was based on a real thing that really happened this year. All right. Like, this is something that really is happening right now. Like, a gay person went out and raped, like, almost 200 men. Like, a gay cis guy went out and raped, like, 200 men and has been convicted. And now conservatives are using this as, like, the basis to attack LGBT people, right? This is literally just that, except move back an inch. That's all it is. And yeah, the reason why it's not trustworthy is because it's anecdotal evidence. It's taking one instance, which may or may not be, which is likely not representative and which isn't representative, as we know from overwhelming data, that is being argued to be representative of something larger than it actually is when it's just not, right? Like, you just happen to find a crazy rapist who happens to be trans. So, yeah, that's all I want to say right now. But just, like, to address some of, like, she's basically arguing against the straw man from the beginning.
Self-ID to the UK have failed, and that's something which is much to the chagrin of various trans activists as well as the massive groups which advocate for their positions.
Yeah, I don't know. This is just like painting trans advocates as with some kind of moral. I don't know.
However, there are countries in which self-ID is a legally recognised thing, and this includes Ireland. And in today's video, I want to discuss one of the most disturbing and alarming examples of self-ID abuse that I have ever come across, and that is the case of Barbie Kardashian.
Yeah, so as we go through this, I really want you to consider what argument she's actually making here, all right? Like, is she arguing that it's technically possible that someone could break the law? Because last time I checked, rape and sexual assault are not allowed. Like, they're against the law. So, like, what is she actually advocating for? Like, what's the reason for talking about this person? Keep an eye on that. We're going to be going forward with that.
Now, on the 25th of September, Independent.ie ran a story which read, "Teenager in custody charged with threats to kill 2 people. It mentions Barbie Kardashian of no fixed abode, who appeared
Rape and sexual assault are bad. Yeah, that's about right.
Before Limerick District Court, charged with 4
Oh, and mind you, at no point are we going to be defending, like, the person that she's talking about. Like, this isn't about defending that person. This isn't about, like, trying to make out the person out to be a good person. I mean, honestly, just based on because I read this article and, like, a bunch of others, it sounds like the person is just, like, a mentally ill person and probably needs psychiatric help and care. But that's not what Rose is talking about. But yeah, no, we're not defending rapists, but we're we're specifically addressing the idea that like, should this be extrapolated to mean something larger than just like an instance of like a crazy rapist who happens to be trans?
Of making threats to kill or cause serious harm. Now, the individuals who were threatened included Barbie's mother. But why am I talking about this? Well, Barbie is a self-identified trans woman. That is someone who doesn't actually have a diagnosis of gender dysphoria.
Also, let's be clear. Hold on. Because I looked up a couple things. I'll link a couple sources because I looked through this. There's like so many articles on this person. Here, let me see if I can find it. If someone can get me the link to the article, I have one of my friends do it. But like Barbie has like gone on the record, or not like on the, I'm not sure if she said it in court, right? But has said before that she wants to get rid of her genitals and has even considered like self-mutilation to get there, right? So like, I don't know what Rose is suggesting here. Like that this person has to like you're not authentically trans until you get like a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. It's like that's the only gate. Like even if you have the symptoms for gender dysphoria, even if you are trans, like until a doctor says that you are trans, well, before that point you are not trans. I am sorry. You are literally the word of a doctor is the word of fucking God. Yeah, it's what about all the crazy self-identified cis people? True. But yeah, so I mean like the argument right here, because I mean also we're talking about someone who presents like pretty femme, right? I mean, obviously the picture that we saw was like pretty crazy. Like here, let's look at some like other examples, right? I think this is an example of her. Let's see, this is the court documents. I mean, most of the pictures that have been circulating are her where she looks like crazy. Yeah, like, I mean, like, say you want, like, yeah, she probably has, like, mental issues. She probably has mental issues, but, like, to say that she's not trans is just kind of wildly speculative, and I think is just, like, she's making basically an assumption, at least based on what she just said, that, like, oh, until a doctor says that you're trans, well, sorry, up until that point, it doesn't really fucking matter how many, like, even if you otherwise show the symptoms for being for having gender dysphoria, which, mind you, is not necessary for being trans at all, but that's a whole nother argument.
This is someone who hasn't undergone any kind of medical transition. This is just someone who says that they are a woman and therefore they are seen as such by the government.
I mean, they presented pretty explicitly as a woman. I mean, even the picture that you showed, like, yeah, they present as a woman. They have said things that would lead people to believe that they're trans and that they have trans feelings. Also, for people who don't know as much about her, she is, like, from what I understand, like, she's homeless, right? She's poor. She was talking about how she wanted to move to, I think it was, like, LA, or somewhere like on the West Coast of America and work for porn so that she could be able to afford medical transition, right? Like this is someone who probably didn't go through medical transition because like they just live in poverty. Also, side note, and I just like this is something I really want to touch on really quickly. And I can say this from the experience of like I literally worked as a program director for a homeless outreach nonprofit in Memphis. Like once you're homeless, it's really easy. It is incredibly easy to get like a whole bunch of other issues that pile on top of it. Usually people run into issues of addiction, lack of opportunity, and like those being combined with being homeless will usually lead people to develop like mental issues. Like I can't tell you how many people came to like the nonprofit I worked for when I was in the South who were homeless and who otherwise had an addiction, and then an additional mental health issue on top of that, because like yeah, when you're literally homeless and addicted and you don't have really any kind of upward mobility, it's really easy to get mental issues, right? Like it happens fucking all the time. So yeah, I don't know why she's just blaming her for being poor. Or maybe she's misrepresenting this. I don't know. It's hard to tell like whether or not she's intentionally lying or just like didn't do all that much research.
And I wanted to kind of discuss Barbie's background so you get a little bit of an idea as to why this is...
Of course, the Tory prick like Rose hates the poor, true.
...such a huge problem. Now, a little bit of a caveat before I continue. Normally when I talk about controversial figures within the trans community, people such as Jessica Yaniv, I'll admit that there's always at least a little bit of a comic element to these people, even if what they're accused of doing is inherently serious. However, despite Barbie's dress sense being, well, bizarre...
I mean, yeah, she probably has mental issues. I don't know. It's not something worth poking fun at. It's just kind of sad. Yeah.
The background is incredibly disturbing, and just to kind of warn people, this is going to be a dark video. So who exactly...
So again, this is literally just like... Again, this goes back to the argument earlier. It's literally just like finding the one super crazy trans person and trying to make an argument based off like how crazy they are. Yeah. Yeah.
Is Barbie Kardashian? Well, not much is really known about this person apart from
speed up
information
because
that
this
came
isn't
from
really
Ireland's Court of Appeal back in
relevant.
April of 2019. And this gives a good summary of their background. Also, I'm going to be using gender-neutral pronouns to describe Barbie throughout this video. The reason for so will become clear as the video goes on. Now, Barbie was born in Ireland on the 25th of December 2001 to parents from overseas. It's not exactly clear which country they came from. However, it should be noted that Barbie's birth name was Alejandro Gentil. I don't know if I pronounced that right. Now, Barbie's upbringing was incredibly chaotic, being raised in what the court described as a household of extreme depravity and domestic violence. Barbie's parents were considered to be in a sadomasochistic relationship of...
I just want people to ask themselves right now. Yeah, comic element, OMG. Yeah, for real. Also, again, like, right now, this is literally just kind of parading someone who has, like, a terrible background as, like, a circus act. She knows what she's doing. But yeah, was this Barbie girl born in 2001? Why are we talking about her as though she's not a teenager? I have no idea. But yeah, I don't know. I still want people to guess, like, what's the relevance of all of this? Because, like, if the argument is that, like, she's crazy and, like, needs to go to, like, a correctional facility or, like, get mental health, then yeah, we agree. But I mean, there are lots of people who are rapists. There are lots of people who commit sexual assault. There are lots of people who do lots of bad things in the world. So, like, the question for me is, why are we singling out this person in particular?
Abuse, with the father in particular being singled out as violent and controlling. The toxicity of the situation naturally spiraled out into Barbie's upbringing, and as a result, Barbie was regularly neglected and even assaulted by their parents. The court...
Rose, come on, Riley show. She never will. Are you kidding me? No, she's scared as shit. She's scared as shit. She knows that. I've already given her the offer. I've offered multiple times, and yeah, I mean, if she's not interested, then I don't really care. But if she puts out content and makes bad arguments, then I'm going to respond to them. If not so that she could see them, then so that the audience can understand why they are wrong. Like, that's the reason I cover people. I don't really, like, ultimately, I don't care about her personally. I care about, like, addressing bad arguments that people make, especially as they, like, concern trans people.
Documents indicate that both parents were abusive, although it does state that Barbie's mother wasn't permitted to hold or comfort the child by the father, which means that the abuse mostly came from the dad. Now,
Rose won't come on here because she's a goddamn coward. True. I mean, that is, like, basically it, right? Yeah?
Barbie would witness the father emotionally and physically abusing their mother regularly, and this even goes so far as to include sexual assault. And eventually, possibly fearing retribution from the father, Barbie would actually join in with the abuse against their mother, which the court said involved strengthening their identification with a cruel and sadistic...
Hey, side note, has anyone seen Silence of the Lambs? I talked about it last time, the Vosh card. We need an emote for that. Can we get, like, someone to make an emote that's, like, Vosh's face on a card? We call it the Vosh card. Yeah, so, I mean, has anyone seen, Silence of the Lambs, right? For those who haven't, let me just summarize what I talked about last time, because a lot of people like making these sorts of arguments, right? Basically, even in the movie, right, the person, the antagonist, or, like, the non-central antagonist, I don't know, like, the movie goes back and forth on who it treats as, like, the main antagonist. We have that command RGR. Nice. Oh no, I want, like, a card, like an emote with the Vosh's face on, like, a card. So it can be like the Vosh card emote. But anyway, no, so Buffalo Bill is treated in the movie, like, back then they didn't even use transgender, they used transvestite, because they were so progressive. But, like, the movie went out of its way to specify that Buffalo Bill wasn't a real transvestite, because Buffalo Bill was subject to a lot of personal abuse at the hands of parents at like a really young age, and had, like, a terrible upbringing, was abused by mother and father. Is this sounding a little bit familiar? Like it's a pretty stereotypical trope that we constantly use to fearmonger against trans people. Is this sounding familiar at all? Yeah. And also, hold on, let's be clear about this. Just like talk about, like, why those representations are bad, even if, like, they go out of their way to try and specify that they're not trans people. Let's see, is transphobia listen? Oh wait, rhetoric devices. So let's talk about this really quick. So, issue, just because a work does not specifically or overtly target a group of people, does that mean that work cannot negatively affect that group? Well, let's talk about some rules. The cultivation theory says that media cultivates or creates for media audiences a picture of the world that looks much like the ones that they see on TV. According to the central premise of cultivation theory, those watching TV are more likely to believe that the world is real, that the real world is like that presented in media, right? Basically, if you watch TV, or, I mean, like, this could be expanded to, like, the internet, or you read about something, right? Then you're going to be more likely to believe that like, that's the way that the world works, right? Additionally, even if people think they may be immune to the effects that media has on our perceptions, evidence has shown this to not be the case. Researchers define this as the third-party effect, where individuals who are not members of the audience as exposed to persuasive communication, whether or not this communication is intended to be persuasive, will expect the communication to have greater effect on others than themselves. So the analysis is that, like, an application of the cultivation theory to continued misuse of, for example, gender nonconformity as the basis for dangerous natures of individuals in books and films and in other public discussions, that can lead people to believe that there is something inherently dangerous about gender nonconforming or trans people if the audience cannot tell the difference, right? So, like, here, what we're talking about is, like, Rose is, I think, trying to make the argument that, like, oh, this isn't a real trans person. But, like, let's be clear, like, this is just fear-mongering against trans people, right? Like, most people can't tell the fucking difference, right? J.K. Rowling can't tell the difference between what a man in a dress is and the trans woman who doesn't pass. And, like, Rose can't tell the difference between this person and herself. I don't know. Like, obviously there are differences, but, like, making the distinction based off that, like, oh, she's not a real trans. She just has all these mental issues. Like, this is a trope that's been played on for a while, and it doesn't really have any effect because most people can't really tell the difference. So, yeah.
Father and weakening their identification with a collapsed but at times benign mother. Professional assessments in years later would state that this was more of a survival instinct, and Bobby didn't join in the abuse specifically because they hated their mother, but this eventually created an association between cold violence and survival, and a disassociation between...
And then they grew up and they became a serial killer that targeted slightly overweight young women with skin so that they could carve out a skin suit and pretend they're a woman. That's literally what this is. This is congratulations, Rose. You just found Buffalo Bill. Wonderful. What point are you trying to prove? Yeah, it's a fucking terrible person.
The actions they were carrying out and the impact on the victim. Eventually, aged around 8, Barbie fled the family home along with their mother, and they ended up staying in a women's refuge between November 2010 and July 2011. Whilst at the refuge, the staff raised significant concerns about violence carried out on Barbie by the mother, so despite fleeing the home...
Not to mention depictions of trans people always being an evil person literally stops trans people from transitioning. True. Yeah, I mean, like, overwhelmingly, all depiction, like, people might be like, oh, well, you know, like, I'm not depicting trans people, so, I mean, like, I'm not really doing any harm to them. But the fact of the matter is, like, especially if you don't otherwise include, like, positive representation, because, like, trans people are, like, overwhelmingly represented negatively in media, right? That's, like, the reason why there's, like, that TV trope, that trope in movies. Again, I recommend people go watch Corviday's video on trans predators. They do a really good in-depth deep dive into, like, how this trope has been used throughout history. But yeah, like, there's a reason why people have, you know, like, there's not much good representation of trans people in media. There are tons of pieces of media with representation like that of trans people that bleed into reality. With comparative example, liberals in the West Wing with Obama administration is another example of base and superstructural and media bleeding into reality. A piece of media dictating how people view the world, how the world works. Not exactly the same. Yeah, no, I can see that comparison.
Barbie was still the victim of abuse. Now, the pair would eventually move into rented accommodation, but a year later, aged around 10, Barbie was placed in emergency foster care after carrying out a violent assault on their mother. Now, from there, Barbie would be placed with 4 different...
Claire said that there's no correlation in the literature between transsexualism and violence. I remember that. Yeah, there's so many, like, very interesting quotes from the movie, to say the least.
Carers over the space of around 17 months, and most of these placements would end early due to Barbie's uncontrollable, erratic, and aggressive behaviour. And this would become a serious pattern over their teenage years. As foster care wasn't working out, Barbie would be moved to a private residential care home.
Make this into an emote. Right now. Right now. Immediately. Make this into an emote. Now. Drag it normal. A car showing Foster's face to be used as an emote. Amazing. Make this into a car. Make this into an emote. Fucking now.
And things...
It's too big. Well, then figure it out. I love it.
Only got worse from here. Barbie's aggressive attitudes continued to escalate once going into private care. Barbie decided to drop out of school in 2014 because they were claimed not to be motivated by receiving perfect exam results, as well as no longer receiving one-to-one tuition with a special needs assistant. And staff who cared for Barbie at the time feared this would make them become a bit too isolated, although they also noted Barbie on tuition with a special needs assistant.
Yeah, I mean, she sounds like someone with mental health issues. That's what this is. Like, she's someone with mental health issues. I don't know what else to say. Yeah, it's a pretty sad situation, all things considered.
Assistant and staff who cared for Barbie at the time feared this would make them become a bit too isolated, although they also noted Barbie was often hostile towards other young people, particularly those housed alongside them. A year later, in 2015, Barbie was moved to a new care home, again due to their behaviour, and not long after arriving, staff noticed that Barbie was exhibiting excessively sexualised behaviour towards the female staff. In fact, Barbie would only ever attack the female staff and seemed to have a strange compliance with what the male staff would request of them. And they also noticed that Barbie...
I feel bad for Barbie, she just needs help. So, like, alright, quick pause, because I understand that there are some people in the audience who might disagree with me on this. Like, generally speaking, I try to take a strictly utilitarian approach to be able to like punishment and rehabilitation. Because like I understand that it's very easy to like look at people and just be like, oh well, I want that person deserves to fucking die. That person deserves to fucking get what they deserve. And mind you, because we're gonna be, I assume, approaching a trans people in prisons argument. Usually like the logical conclusion of like arguing against allowing trans people or like trans predators, heavy quotations, into women's prisons, like a natural consequence of that would be putting them into like men's prisons, right? Except there's evidence that we'll get into that like disproportionately they're subjected overwhelmingly to like rape and sexual assault in men's prisons, right? Like that's how that's where we're currently at in most prisons in like at least the US. And so like once you say that, I feel like a lot of them probably just wouldn't care. They would be like, oh, like they might not say this out loud. This is the part that they wouldn't say out loud, right? But they might be like, oh, well, I don't really care. Like they should get what they deserve. Yeah, they deserve to be raped. I would advise people to not adopt that perspective. I would advise people to think against it. Retributivism it has like a visceral appeal on an emotional level. But like I would say as a policy purpose that we should try to adopt like, I don't know if you want to call it like punishment or like a system of justice that focuses on rehabilitating people who do things that we hold as society to be morally wrong and make it so that they can get back into society. Because I mean, like this, I think it's pretty obvious, at least to me, that this is largely caused by like mental health issues. This person doesn't seem like someone to like, I mean, like, yeah, they've done like a ton of terrible things. And yeah, like there needs to be like an accounting for that. But unless we're going to just fucking kill the person, then it's probably better to like try and think of like ways to be able to help this and similar types of people be able to get the mental health that they need. Personal hot take. I understand that people will disagree with me on that. People will be like, oh, well, I think she should just burn. She's a terrible person. RGR, how about we do in Denmark and give people in apartment-sized private cells that make prisons co-ed? I mean, it's an interesting idea. But yeah, like Barbie is a tragic victim of her circumstance. I feel like people don't ever care about fixing issues that cause these crimes. They rather feel good to than do measurable good to society. Yeah, I mean, like that's basically it, right? Like when we take the position that like, oh, well, this person did X bad thing. Well, we should just say fuck them and just throw them into a cell to rot until such time where they might be able to get out, right? What you do is you basically like you don't subject that person to die, but if they ever happen to get out of prison, then there's really no way that they could be able to live like a meaningfully substantive life in the way that you and I do, right? Like at least in the US, they're largely prohibited from voting. They're largely unable to get any meaningful job after they get out. They usually end up back on the streets, just from my experience, having worked in the, like again, like another quality that a lot of people who came to us had, like a lot of people that came to us had, was that like they had been in prison at least once, if not multiple times, right? Like once you've been in prison, it's very hard to get out of poverty. Nice. And so like, yeah, that's my short PSA on utilitarianism versus retributivism. I would encourage people to try and take a more utilitarian mindset, but I understand that's hard, like from an intuitive stance. So I'm not going to push around people too much on it.
These physical assaults had a relatively premeditated element to them. Barbie was moved to yet another care home after assaulting a female member of staff, and the local care unit engaged in several meetings with specialists.
Nice. I love it.
Concerning Barbie's violence and sexualized behavior towards women. Barbie was moved again in December 2015, although this time it was because Barbie was threatened by another resident. It is around this time that the trans question comes into play. Now, it's not exactly clear which residents...
Oh, hold up. I'm going to rewind a little bit just to get the full context.
Unit engaged in several meetings with specialists concerning Barbie's violence and sexualized behavior towards women. Barbie was moved again in December 2015, although this time it was because Barbie was threatened by another resident. It is around this time that the trans question comes into play.
The T question. Oh shit. Oh shit, we're talking about the T question, fam. Talking about the T question. Well, hey, at least she's not bringing up the JQ. All right, at least she's not going that far.
Now, it's not exactly clear which residency this occurred in, but at some point around Christmas 2015, staff noticed that Barbie started to wear a lot of makeup, and not long afterwards, Barbie would demand to be referred to as a female.
Now, again, she said that Barbie never exhibited any signs or symptoms of being trans, but, like, correct me if I'm wrong, wearing lots of makeup and presenting, again, like, this is, like, overly caricatured. I feel like she's intentionally having this here. Obviously, she didn't, look like this all the time, right? But like, I don't know, Rose. Like, wearing a lot of makeup and asking to be referred to as a woman kind of sounds like trans symptoms. I don't know. Just my hot take on it. I don't know. But you have something to say. So what's up?
It should also be noted around this time, Barbie was sharing a residence with a trans person, or at least someone who identified as being trans.
Oh. All right, this is an interesting argument. I did not anticipate this argument. Yeah, for real. I didn't anticipate this argument. Okay, so she's got, all right, so the argument is basically, hey, let me get some Riley gods in chat if I'm right. I mean, I know that I'm right. I can see the argument. Basically, it's going to be an argument that, like, oh, she only started exhibiting, like, a lot of symptoms about being trans once she started living with a trans person, so she's not actually trans. She's just, like, adopting this characteristic that she observed from another trans person who was actually trans, instead of, you know, what might be more likely that actually she had a lot of feelings for like a long time and she only learned how to be able to express them when she was around the trans person, which is a pretty common thing, right? Like, there are a lot of, like, I know some people, like, fuck, I can name some YouTubers who are like this, who basically don't know for the longest time that they are trans, who basically don't know for a long time that they're trans until they meet the trans person. They're like, oh, wow, that explains everything. But yeah, so let's see what argument she makes. I'm very curious.
Trans. Now, whilst all this was going on, Barbie was referred to the Tavistock and Portman Clinic in Manchester. Now, they are a gender-identified clinic in the UK. Now, for those who don't know, it's fairly common for the Irish healthcare system to refer their patients over to England for treatment. Now, Barbie had their appointment at Tavistock in March of 2017, and on paper, it looked like they were ticking all the right boxes to be diagnosed with gender dysphoria. However, the doctors were hugely suspicious of Barbie's answers, believing this was information that Barbie had learned, rather than it being a genuine feeling that they had. A report from Tavistock stated all the facts were correct, but there was no emotional impact. The specialist concluded that Barbie was a young person with a siege mentality who was on the verge of an offensive attack at all times and who related to the specialist only in terms of how they might impact them. Now, as a result of this meeting, Barbie was not diagnosed with gender dysphoria and has not undergone any kind of medical transition at all. So that is no hormones and that is no surgery. And this does come into play with Barbie's attitudes later.
She don't miss! She don't miss! She don't miss! Yeah, literally, okay, so it's the doctors who made the argument. Yeah, but basically it's just like, oh, well, because she wasn't emotionally invested enough, or because she had primarily learned these things from other people, that she's not actually trans. Yeah, amazing. She just wasn't emotional enough, fam. She wasn't emotional enough. She's still treating it like J.K. Rowling's book IRL. Yeah, exactly. That's what it is, right? It's literally, oh, well, she didn't get the proper diagnosis for being authentically trans, even though she exhibited all the symptoms, because she wasn't emotionally invested enough, and she probably just learned them from the person who she was living with. Because otherwise, why she brought it up was completely irrelevant. Like, that's the inference, right? No, it's literally just an argument that she's not actually trans. She just adopted these behaviors from other people. She don't fucking miss. Anyway, let's go on.
And now we come to May of 2018, and this is when things get even more dark. Now, on the 1st of May 2018, Barbie attended court alongside 2 care workers. Now, I'm going to read from the judgment as to what actually happened following this appointment in court. Barbie was irate and unhappy at the prospect they had to return to court a week later for a further remand hearing, and it was suggested to...
The problem with Blair White's be the good token that the expense of everyone else strategy only works for one person, whereas none others can't do it. It doesn't work. It collapses back on gender variety, transphobia. Yeah, no, that's exactly right? It's literally it's climbing up the ladder and pulling it up behind yourself. Except the problem is, like, there are other people also in front of her pulling up the ladder behind themselves, right? Like, let's be clear. Like, these people might be able to appeal to, like, the more conservative, like, anti-LGBT whatever, like, groups or categories or, like, people that they do for a little bit. But, like, those people don't authentically see her as, like, the Rose's art, like, audience, like, let's be real, by and large, they probably don't see her as a woman. Blair's audience probably doesn't see her as a woman, right? Like, you can read the comments on any of their videos and you're gonna find that, right? No matter how hard they try, which is kind of sad. Is this Rose person transphobic? Probably, yeah. I think it's pretty obvious, but hey, I'm gonna leave that to you. You all, I'm just presenting the evidence. Y'all can make whatever conclusions that you feel is appropriate.
To them that should they fail to attend, there was a risk that they might be remanded in custody. Barbie then lunged without warning at the social care worker who was driving the motor vehicle, grabbing her hair and face. Barbie's nails were long and manicured at the time. They dug their nails into the social care worker's eyes, tearing her eyelid.
RGR World Doctors let you medically transition if you don't have gender dysphoria diagnosis. Yeah, there are places like, well, it depends on where you are in the U.S. There are mixed systems. Usually every place that you go to will require looking at your medical history to make sure that you don't have any mental issues that would be caused, or that your body would otherwise react fine to taking HRT. But, like, there are informed consent clinics in the United States. Like, those are a thing. Usually what happens is that you'll go to the informed consent clinic. They will ask for your medical history. You provide it to them. They'll provide you with a form that says like, hey, here's all the effects of HRT. Come back in 2 weeks so that you can have time to think this over and review it. Like, that's what I did, right? Like, I went to an informed consent clinic. And basically they went through all these steps to like make sure that I was like mentally and physically fine to take it. They also took my blood to make sure that I would be fine taking it. And then I got my prescription. It was fine. But yeah, you don't necessarily need a gender dysphoria diagnosis to be trans if you go to an informed consent clinic. Although like there are some places in the US where it is necessary, or like it'll basically be like what a therapist will require you to have if you need to go through a therapist.
The social care worker required hospitalisation as a result of the injury sustained. The social care worker managed to stop the car on the public highway. Barbie repeated, "I am going to kill you." Barbie tore amounts of hair from the head of the social worker. Barbie wrapped their legs around the victim's head and chest, refusing to let go, and bit the care worker on the hand, continuing to pull at her hair and scrape her face. Now, following the assault, police actually found clumps of the social worker's hair in Barbie's pockets. And Barbie openly told the police that they wanted to murder the care worker and appeared to be visibly annoyed that the victim was still alive. Barbie was actually quoted as saying, "It was music to my ears to hear her scream and cry while asking me to stop." Barbie also admitted to having a list of all the care workers that they wanted to assault, including for reasons such as how they were spoken to. Barbie was then taken to the Connolly Hospital in Blanchardstown, where Barbie openly shared their desire.
Again, like this isn't really like so far there's no like I'm not disputing any of this. Yeah, it sounds like Barbie was like a pretty mentally fucked up person, or still is. RGR, this is the UK. Is this the UK? The informed consent doesn't exist in the UK, like the US, so not for the UK. Damn it. Yeah, like again, I'm not disputing this is a terrible person, but like I'm still looking for like why this is relevant.
To murder the staff. Surprisingly, though, Barbie was not found to be clinically psychotic. Now, as a result of the assault,
is Riley doing call-ins today? Probably not. I have like a full stream schedule. Maybe later. I'll see how fast we get through the stuffs.
Barbie was eventually sentenced to 5 months detention in Overstown Children's Detention Campus, and whilst in the facility, Barbie made serious claims of wanting to commit suicide as a result of not being recognised as a woman. Now, obviously, these claims are...
And again, hey, suicide for not being recognized as a woman. Again, like she probably has like a bunch of mental health issues, but I don't know. That sounds pretty consistent for being trans. I don't know. You ask me. Especially considering that like the doctor said that she wasn't like emotionally invested enough, and that was the reason why he didn't give her the diagnosis, even though she said that she would commit suicide if she wasn't able to transition. Amazing.
Wanting to commit suicide were taken seriously. However, it was noted by one specialist, Professor Harry Kennedy, that the threats of suicide are instrumental, designed to achieve another purpose, to manipulate clinicians towards complying with Barbie's wish to be referred for gender reassignments.
This is literally just all speculation, right? Like, the threats are just instrumental. Oh, so she's actually also designed to achieve another purpose, to manipulate clinicians towards complying with G's wish to be referred for gender reassignment. So it's not that she wanted to talk about, it's not like that she made the suicide threats so that she could get transition care. It's that she made the suicide threats so that she could get transition care. Because those are totally different things. Yeah. I don't know. I'm just reacting as I see it.
Surgery. Now, despite their attempts to receive transition treatment failing to achieve the desired outcome, Barbie would still openly declare that they hated their male genitalia and actually also had a dream of moving to Los Angeles to become a sex worker as a way of funding various plastic surgeries.
Oh yeah, hey, there you go. All right, we're on the same page.
Now, Barbie was eventually put in a special care unit due to being openly homicidal, which Barbie contested in court, and that judgment is where most of this information comes from. But this order was due to run out on Barbie's 18th birthday, and with Barbie openly declaring a desire to murder and rape, it was clear they posed a real danger to society at large, especially as Barbie was only willing to live in accommodation with female staff, who Barbie openly wanted to harm. Now, Barbie was actually held until September of this year.
To be honest, discovering we have actual mental illness is what made us realize our trans is not one of them. Yeah, I mean, like, listen, the story is in Ireland, by the way, not the UK. Yeah, I mean, like, trans is not one of them. Like, I want people, like, this kind of sucks, too, also, just for a general policy purpose, that it kind of, like, really adds a ton of stigma to, like, having mental issues. And, like, I don't want to, like, morally impugn people for having mental issues, right? Like, if you have mental issues, then I want to, like, encourage people to seek necessary care, right? Because right now all that we're doing is we're literally, like, so far the entirety of this video is just parading around this person's life and making a circus out of them because it's so funny. Yeah, so I don't know, as like a policy purpose, this seems kind of shitty because, like, I don't want to, like, disincentivize people from seeking, like, the necessary medical care that they need. You know, RGR, people can be mentally ill and trans. Yeah, that's kind of the point, right? Like, there's the, like, being trans does not exempt you from having mental illness, right? Like, I'm sorry, it doesn't. And I know that there's like some studies that like trans people experience like higher rates of like depression and anxiety, which is not surprising considering the society that we live in. Where literally we have people like even in the trans community like throwing this kind of shit around. Yeah. No, it's not surprising, right? Anyone can be mentally ill or commit crime. Yeah, that's exactly it. RGR can be extremely difficult, and gatekeeping if you're mentally or autistic, they chalk it up to being an artifact of that. Yeah, basically.
When the High Court ruled that there was no legal basis to keep them in detention. And when Barbie was being released, police, or the Garda as they were referred to in Ireland, actually put out a notice warning people that a potentially dangerous individual was being released into the public. And it wasn't long after this that Barbie was then arrested for making threats against 2 people, again including their own mother. Now as a result of this, Barbie, who has a history of violence and sexualised behaviour towards women, was then placed in a women's prison in Limerick, where they are going to remain until they await instructions from the Director of Public Prosecutions around the 30th.
All right, here we go. We're getting into the argument. We're finally getting to the trans women in prisons argument. All right, Rose. Unless you're going to say, yeah, it's fine. It's totally good. Except I expect that all this setup is basically to make the argument that she shouldn't be put in women's prisons. But hey, let's hear it. Let's hear the arguments.
13th of October. But how did all this happen? As I mentioned earlier, Barbie went to a gender clinic and was not given a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. So how could someone with no gender dysphoria who openly wishes to harm women, not just harm them, but sexually assault and even murder?
Again, like she's literally making it that because she didn't, this is a fucking great frame to freeze on. She's literally making it that because she didn't get a diagnosis that she isn't trans and therefore she shouldn't be transferred. Like that's what it is. Apparently if a doctor doesn't believe that you're trans enough, then you actually aren't. Sorry. You don't pass the threshold of being trans, right? This is kind of the problem with trans medicalism, right? Like at its most basic, like this is the problem with like a lot of trans medicalism logic is that like it is important. Now mind you, right? Like I rely on a lot of medical consensus, right? Like I rely on a lot of medical consensus for my arguments, right? But literally when we're talking about someone just kind of like when you are diagnosed for gender dysphoria, mind you, like when you are diagnosed, and I can talk about this because like, oh, fuck, I'm a trans person. We're doing some anecdotal Andrea time, baby. Because I was diagnosed. I didn't have to do it for like when I got my prescription, but like I went and I sought out someone independently just to like, you know, cross my T's and dot my I's. But basically when I did, all that it was me sitting down across from another doctor and just like, hey, doc, I think I might be trans. And they were like, okay. And then they asked me a couple questions and I answered and they're like, yeah, you're probably trans. And I was like, oh, well, shit. I mean, obviously it was like, you know, I'd known for a while basically, but you know, that was like the first time I had heard like a medical professional tell me, right? But like the matter of fact is, right, like at the end of the day, it's just kind of a matter of like whether or not the doctor, like for getting a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, actually Natalie ContraPoint's video on this is really good, right? I can't remember. I think it's the Tiffany Tumbles one. Or no, it's dang it, it's the non-binary one. What is that? It's the one with Baltimore, Maryland, where Baltimore asked Tiffany Tumbles, like, well, Tiffany Tumbles, did the doctor look at your brain? Well, Tiffany Tumbles, did the doctor take a scan of your brain? No. Well, so what you're telling me is that the doctor based their diagnosis off of your feelings? Yeah. We stay in Baltimore, Maryland. Damn right. Also because I live there. Hooray. But yeah, so I mean, like, literally, like, I think it's entirely reasonable that, like, someone who is trans, especially someone who has, like, a ton of fucking mental issues, amazing, could talk to a doctor, and the doctor might just not believe them, but they still might otherwise, like, very well be trans, especially if they exhibit, like, all of the other symptoms otherwise. Yeah. So I don't see it as, like, that surprising that she was moved to, like, a woman's prison, personally. Hot take. Maybe that's too scalding hot. That's the hot take.
Women ends up in a women's prison. Well, it's because of self-ID. See, in Ireland, in order to self-identify as a woman, you simply need to provide a declaration that you wish to live as that gender, as well as a proof of address and your birth certificate.
Oh, there you go. All right, cool. So Rose, okay, so she self-ID'd in Ireland. Apparently, that's all that you need. Cool. So she's in a woman's prison. What's the problem? What's the problem, Mo? Is there an issue? Yeah, she's in prison. What's the problem, Rose?
That's it. The entire process can be done in a matter of minutes. This is in complete contrast to the UK, where you need to have a medical diagnosis of gender dysphoria, along with...
Obviously, also, I know what she's gonna... Like, I understand what the arguments that she's gonna make are. I'm just waiting for her to actually say them.
real life lived experience of being that particular gender. Now, it is very clear that the island system has totally failed in this instance. There's no debate around this. Barbie is someone who is clearly a present danger to many people, many women, specifically women. And yet, simply because Barbie has this piece of paper saying that they are legally declared a woman, that means that they get access to the women's prison. And in fact,
Okay. We finally arrived at the argument. Okay. So, we already talked, all right, so like to begin, right? We already talked about the trans predators argument. All right. We talked about how, like, by and large, like, most trans people don't fit into this categorization. All right. But yeah, so let's just take a look. All right. I want to talk about trans people in prisons. All right. I want to talk about trans people in prisons. Now, I guess that the question for Rose, right? Oh my God. Burp. I don't know why I'm burping. This is just like, it's peppermint tea. I don't know. But the question is, all right, so even in the most extreme scenario, right, where you have someone like Barbie Kardashian, who is put into a woman's prison, should they or should she be allowed in that prison, right? So let's talk about some hot facts, right? Now, mind you, all this data comes from the U.S. I'm assuming that it's analogous enough to be able to apply. To the extent it isn't, then you can make valid criticisms. But yeah, like I'm studying U.S. law. But yeah, so let's talk about some quick stats. According to Just Detention International, in most cases, correctional agencies make gender classifications based on genitalia and not a person's gender identity, right? Broadly speaking, that's how it works. I guess that's not how it works in Ireland. That's probably for the better, honestly, as we're going to see later on. As such, transgender women are held in men's facilities and called he. Transgender men are held in women's facilities and called she. This is the way it is overwhelmingly in America. In many cases, the gender identity of transgender inmates is simply ignored, and they are denied gender-appropriate clothing and hygiene products. Because transgender women are typically housed in men's facilities, they often have to shower and change their clothes in front of male inmates and staff. Once targeted for abuse, the majority of transgender survivors are subjected to repeated sexual assaults. Great, right? I know. Furthermore, in many facilities, officials have a standing policy to house transgender inmates in solitary confinement, either as soon as they enter the facility or after they have been sexually assaulted. Sometimes officials make such housing decisions in an attempt to protect transgender people. Other times, the isolation itself is used as more of a form of abuse. Regardless of intent, solitary confinement causes significant emotional distress. Inmates who are locked down into tiny cells for 23 hours a day are cut off from vital sources and programs. Not surprisingly, many transgender rape survivors suffer in silence, afraid that speaking out will result in isolation, right? So overwhelmingly, and mind you, there's going to be a lot to say, effectively the same things. Yeah, trans women in men's prisons results in like overwhelming harm to them, right? Like that's the result. Like if you put a trans woman into a men's prison, like shit gets bad really fast. Additionally, according to a report published by the Sylvia Rivera Law Project on transgender intersex people in New York State's men's prisons, quote, transgender women, gender nonconforming people, and intersex people are frequent and visible targets for discrimination and violence and are subject to daily refusals by correctional officers and other prisoners to recognize their gender identity. Two of the main types of housing in which a prisoner may be placed are general population and protective custody. Remember this. Actually, why is this not bolded? We're going to come back to this later, fam. This is something we're going to come back to. Protective custody units are reserved for people who are at higher risk of violence or harassment by other prisoners, those who are receiving additional punishment, or those who are seen as more likely to commit violent acts towards others. Hold on to this. It's a surprise tool that will help us later. Individuals placed in protective custody can include judges, politicians, people convicted of sex-related offenses, police officers, or people who might be targets of violence based on their gender expression or sexual orientation. Interesting. A specific categorization or a specific placement for people who are either like likely to be victims of violence or who are likely to commit acts of sexual violence against other people. Interesting. It's like prisons already have a built-in system for addressing what to do with like people who are at high risk of committing sexual assault. Amazing. The level of safety that protective custody actually provides, however, varies among facilities. Thank you. Oh my God. You just gifted like 5 subs. So there's going to be a lot of that. Holy shit. Thank you. I'm going to keep going, even if it keeps going. The level of safety that protective custody actually provides, however, varies among facilities, sometimes providing a safe refuge from the violence of other prisoners, while other times isolating prisoners and thereby placing them at a greater risk of violence at the hands of correctional officers. However, other SLP clients report that placement in protective custody is undesirable because it makes them more vulnerable to harassment and assault by correctional officers. and by correctional officers. Clients also cite the constraints it places on their relative mobility and access to vocational and recreational programs. There's a couple of like specific instances. I don't want to keep this too long, so we're not going to talk about them, but like basically people who are trans who are in male prisons who describe their experiences. Because transgender, gender nonconforming, and intersex people in men's prisons are often highly visible, they become frequent targets for homophobic and transphobic violence and brutality. As one interviewee put it, I'm 6'3". I'm like a walking target. Although the majority of interviewees reported that the violence and abuse that they encounter at the hands of correctional officers, which is pretty fucking crazy to think about it, like it's not even the inmates, right? Many interviewees also described incidences of assault and harassment from other prisoners. Importantly, these instances were never without either the implicit permission or active participation of correctional officers, right? Like, let's be clear, trans women are mistreated not only by their other inmates in men's prisons, but also by the officers who will sometimes like either just like implicitly give permission to the other prisoners to be able to assault them, or who just join in. Additionally, according to a report on the National Transgender Discrimination by the National Center for Transgender Equality and the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, while 7% of the sample reported being held in a cell due to their gender identity expression alone, these rates skyrocketed for Black and Latino respondents. Respondents who served time in jail reported harassment by correctional officers 37%, more than harassment by peers. That's consistent with what we just read earlier. Physical and sexual assaults in jails and prisons is a real problem. 16% of respondents who had been to jail or prison reported being physically assaulted, and 15% reported being sexually assaulted. And African American respondents reported much higher rates of physical and sexual assault in prison by other inmates and correctional officers than their counterparts. So hey, we have an intersectional argument. Also, this source is really good for discussing systemic racism in prisons from like an LGBT lens. So I recommend checking it out if you want to look at that. Additionally, in a study on violence and sexual assault in the California correctional facilities, 59% of the trans people that they surveyed in prisons reported experiencing sexual assault, and 48.3% reported engaging in sexual acts that, from their point of view, were not against their will, but nonetheless that they would rather not do. Coercive sexual activities, right? Like basically they do it to get favors, is basically what it's saying. Because they otherwise are basically forced to, or they have to. This is like a pretty common problem for like a lot of women in prisons, not just trans people. Like there are a lot of women in prisons who will like specifically perform like sexual acts for police officers or for like prison officers in order to get things that they otherwise basically need. It's a larger problem, but it definitely affects trans women just as well. There's no reason it wouldn't otherwise. 41.2% of the transgender inmates designated at least one sexual assault incident to be rape, and 50% of the inmates from the transgender sample were raped at least once, when rape was defined as oral or anal penetration by force or threat of force. Which is just great. For the vast majority of transgender inmates, prison violence is overwhelmingly sexual. 53% reported being sexually and non-sexually victimized, with only 13% never experiencing violence in a California facility. Sexual assault, misconduct, victimization in correctional facilities is more prevalent among transgender inmates. Transgender inmates report sexual assault by a factor of 13.4 compared to inmates in random sample, right? I mean, like, there's so much information on all of this, right? Like, there's so much fucking information on all this. Hold on, where is it? The United States Department of Justice Bureau of Justice Statistics and Sexual Victimization, or Bureau of Justice Statistics, even they affirm that, like, trans people are, like, disproportionately treated in men's prisons, right? It's overwhelmingly the consensus that especially trans women in men's prisons is terrible for them, right? And also, there's no evidence. There's no studies that show that, like, trans women pose a unique threat to cis women in women's prisons, right? Like, we already talked about this earlier, right? We talked about the fact that, hold on, let's go back up here really quick. All the trans predator stuff, all the studies and evidence that we looked at earlier, like, that applies very much here, right? Like, there's no evidence that, like, trans women pose unique threats to cis women, either in bathrooms or in prisons, right? Like, there's just no evidence for it. So the overwhelming consensus is that since trans women are forced into men's prisons in America, by virtue of their genitalia, they are disproportionately the victims of sexual assault and violence by both prison inmates and staff, not the perpetrators of that violence. Furthermore, our prison systems already have systems for housing prisoners who have propensities for sexual violence. Like, we already have that, and I suspect that they also have that over in Ireland as well, right? Like, yeah, you need a place where you're going to put your sexual predators, right? Like, that doesn't apply for just trans people. Like, just like the person that we talked about earlier, mind you, the person who we talked about, the gay rapist from the hypothetical, the very real person, was housed in a men's correctional facility. Like, yeah, we have places to put sexual predators in prisons. We already have, like, that's already settled. There's no reason to otherwise put them, when they're probably safer in the prison with the gender that they identify with, into a prison where we know that they're going to be victims of sexual assault and harassment. There's no reason to. There's no empirical basis, and we already account for them. This is how we treat anyone who is prone to sexual violence, regardless of whether or not they are transgender. There are rapists and sexual predators of all backgrounds in prisons. This is not unique to transgender people. The focus of trans people is just an echo of the same kinds of anecdotal arguments that have been used to attack minorities throughout history. Whether it was black people, gay people, Muslim people, or so on. Like, literally, it's like this argument has been applied to, like, any minority. We just chose to also analogize it to, like, a gay person, since that's something that's literally evolving this year. The reason these one-off instances are not trustworthy as basis for treating an entire category of people different is because they are specifically amplified due to selection bias. This is also the reason why no reputable study has concluded that trans women do pose a unique threat to cis women in prisons, and in fact, they have concluded the opposite. So no, trans women should not be forced into men's prisons. Like, I get that this is a terrible person. I get that this person poses a threat to other people, but, like, there are ways to be able to deal with that in women's prisons. Like, there are. There are.
Bobby solicitors preemptive.
And then also, if we were to put, like, her into, like, a men's prison, I mean, like, also, let's be real, that she should be put into, like, a mental health facility. That's where she should be put at. That's like where she should go, right? But, like, let's be real. This person is just someone who needs help. And if they were to be put into a men's prison, then they would be, like, overwhelmingly the victim of sexual violence and harassment.
Argued against moving them to a male prison because apparently that would be too distressing for them. And this is where the real argument about the whole self-ID rules come into play, because we are regularly told by trans activists that self-ID poses absolutely no risk, and kind of put up this image that nobody is ever going to abuse such a system. Now, in the UK, we've seen people such as Karen White, and whilst we don't have a similar kind of system to Ireland, which has had theirs in place since around 2015, we have seen instances of people who really shouldn't be in women's spaces but have been moved in there and have been...
Your Honor, none of my studies are reputable, so... Amazing. Rose definitely wants to be the one of the good ones. Oh yeah, no, for sure.
A threat to the inhabitants. Now, I'm not making an argument here that trans people are going to be inherently dangerous, or that anyone who simply self-identifies as a woman is going to be a dangerous individual. That's not what I'm saying at all. However, the rules on self-ID mean that it is indeed open to abuse. Barbie should not have received a gender recognition certificate and would never have received one in the UK because...
All right, and here's the thing, because we already talked about this earlier. Yeah, like, there's a possibility that someone could abuse this law. There's a possibility that someone could abuse this law, but, like, this is the same reason why, like, the argument that we should prohibit trans people or, like, trans women from being able to go into women's bathrooms is ridiculous. Because, like, if someone is going to commit rape, the fact that they could, like, take advantage of a law to be able to go into a women's space to be able to rape them doesn't really change the fact that they are already thinking about violating the law, like another on-the-books law in the first place. Rape is illegal. Harassment is illegal, or, like, physical harassment. Assault is illegal. These are things which are already illegal. It makes no sense to put another law or to prevent someone legally from being able to, like, identify with the gender that they, you know, identify with. Like, there's no reason to impose that kind of a legal restriction because, like, imposing that legal restriction is not going to stop those people from otherwise violating the laws that they were going to violate. It's literally just, oh, well, now I just need to violate another law. Like, it doesn't change that they were going to violate the law in the first place. It just means that they're going to violate another one. Like, it literally makes no sense. And you're just going to end up, like, disproportionately harming trans people who just want to fucking live their life. Like, that's the issue. Like, yeah, it's technically possible. Anyone can technically abuse a self-ID law. Yeah, it just is a question of, like, whether or not that's a reasonable fear. And the fact is, it's not. It's not. We know overwhelmingly, like, yeah, we have these one-off instances where people can abuse them. But yeah, there are one-off instances where bad people do anything. And people try to use them to attack minorities. One bad person does not paint an entire category of persons. This is why anecdotal evidence, this is why ignoring selection bias leads to these kind of crazy one-off solutions or one-off conclusions.
they lack that diagnosis of gender dysphoria. And just to kind of touch on that a little bit, one of the oppositions that trans activists have towards the medical process is that they believe that people can use effectively cheat sheets as a way of getting their diagnosis. However, as the Barbie case has shown, Tavistock and Portman can be very strict when it comes to actually diagnosing people with gender dysphoria. Barbie's answers didn't really line up into...
Literally, the doctor said that she just wasn't passionate enough. There are scenarios that RGR is not considering. Like what? What kind of scenarios am I not considering? Yeah, please tell me. No, if there are scenarios I'm not considering, yeah, please tell me. Yeah, I really want to hear it. No, I feel like this is a pretty logically consistent argument. Yeah, no, please tell me. Because, I mean, like, if literally the only argument is that, like, oh, well, technically people can take advantage of this law in order to violate other laws, it makes literally no sense for people, like, to put an imposition on these people to be restricted from, like, women's spaces, heavy quotations, to try and prevent them from breaking a law that they're already going to break. It makes no sense. It makes no sense.
Terms of how they actually feel, and they kind of clicked on very quickly that they were reading from cheat sheets. When it comes to the argument of self-ID, there needs to be a lot of honesty about what it really means to simply allow people to self-identify in that sense. What I would like to see for the proponents of self-ID is to openly acknowledge situations like Barbie Kardashian, along with people like Karen White, people who clearly abuse these systems as a way of getting to victims, because these activists can repeatedly tell us that this will not happen. That is their position, and they can't
wait.
The goalposts and just say, oh, well, that's only just one example. If Barbie Kardashian can do it, so can many other people. Now, I'm...
Holy shit! Literally just a complete straw man. No one is saying that these things can't happen. The question is whether or not these are reasonable concerns or like a reasonable... The question is whether or not these happen so much that it's statistically significant that people can that people would abuse these, that the existence of these laws are a but-for cause for these people going out and doing the things that they do. Like, the argument that she is making is that by virtue of these laws existing, that those are the things that cause people to go out and commit these kinds of violent actions. But there's no evidence for that. For all that we know, these people would have gone out and done the exact same things because, mind you, they still violated the law either way. There's no evidence to say that but for these laws not existing, that they wouldn't have gone out and done the things that they did. That's the point. Is that, yeah, you're going to find like one or two crazy trans people. No one is saying that they don't exist or that there aren't like crazy trans people. There are crazy people in every category. There are like rapists in every category of persons, however you want to define it. It doesn't mean that we should like impose limitations on the entire category of that person belongs to in a certain regard. I think the argument that they're trying to make is if a trans woman is seen as a woman, it'll make it easier for her to get away with, it'll be easier for her to get away with assault, but that means the focus should be on stopping women from getting away from assault, not zeroing in on villainizing trans women. Yeah, why don't we go ahead and just, like, stop assault generally? Are there religious exemptions in prisons? Interesting, Jangles. We talked about, like, religious self-identification before, but yeah, from what I understand, there are. Yeah, no, we already talked about the fact that, like, we already have, like, personal self-identification laws as far as like religion goes, but no one says anything bad about that because it's religion. But yeah, what's up, Jangles? I'm gonna go a little bit since we're almost at the finish. I know that we're going a little bit over, but I really want to do this video justice because I mean, like the trans predator argument I see brought up so much. I mean, literally, she's arguing against straw man. We've already kind of established that she's arguing against straw man. But I wanted to like do a deep dive into like this argument, especially because like it has trans women in prisons. It's got trans women in prisons. It's got the trans predators argument. It's got like trans men arguments. It's got it all, baby. It's a quintessential Rose of Dawn video. So I wanted to do it good diligence because I'm kind of getting bored with her. So.
Any kind of gender recognition act. I am actually a big supporter of the current gender recognition act that we have in the UK. However, it's fair to have a discussion when people's lives are at risk as a result of self-ID in this specific instance. Barbie Kardashian is one of the worst examples of self-ID I have ever come across. Even the likes of Jessica Yaniv pale in comparison to this individual. It is important that people are aware of what is going on. And again, to make it clear, because I know I'll be taken out of context here, this is not an attack on trans people. Hell, I am a trans woman myself. This is Barbie.
I love the camaraderie between Jangles and Riley, respectively king and queen, gay debate person. Oh yeah, totally. Listen, Jangles is like we are peanut butter to jelly. All right, we are. I really want to do more tag team, or I want to do any tag teams with Jangles. I feel like that would be great.
I don't believe is even trans. I believe this is someone who has had an incredibly warped upbringing, who is a clear danger to so many people, and has found a way of being able to gain access to victims. Despite Barbie's upbringing, they are...
Oh, hey! By the way, again, called it from earlier. Oh, it's not a real trans person. This is just someone who happened to be exposed to trans people when she happened to live with a trans person and just used this to co-opt for her own personal gains. She don't miss! She don't miss! PB&J is now both of your debate team, the hip-hop act name. Amazing. All right, I feel like I've heard enough. So yeah, like, again, like, the thing about it, and just like, hold on, what's going on with my headset? Just to put a pin in it, because I want people to think back to the hypothetical at the beginning, right? Why is it relevant that you have one person who belongs to a category of persons who happens to be a bad person? Like, what does that matter? What is the relevance? Like, that's really what I want to ask. Now, the best faith, I think that honestly, like, the most steel man kind of argument is that Rose wants to say, well, all that is showing is that it's possible that someone might be able to, like, take advantage of, in this case, self-identification laws, to be able to get access to, like, trans women or not trans women, like, cis women in spaces, to be able to, like, commit acts of violence against them. The problem with that is that what you're doing is you are singling out a single person based on confirmation bias. And again, like, for people who don't know what confirmation bias is, it's basically when you pick a particular data point, that confirms your arguments, regardless of, like, the vast majority of overwhelming, like, empirical evidence to the contrary, right? Like, that's the problem with anecdotal evidence. And the problem here is that what you have is a person who, yeah, is terrible, but yeah, there will be crazy people who belong to any category, right? And, like, contrary to what Rose might believe, like, no one is denying that existence, right? Like, no one is denying that this person went out and did terrible things. The question is whether or not we should allow that person's existence, we should allow that person's actions to color the way that we treat trans rights for people either in the UK or in the US. And the answer is that we shouldn't, because there's no evidence that trans women, by virtue of the fact that they are trans and by virtue of taking advantage of, like, these self-identification laws, actually go out and commit disproportionately more violence against people, against cis women in these kinds of spaces. We know that's not the case. We know that trans women and otherwise gender nonconforming, we know that trans people in general are usually the victims of violence in, like, usually, like, it's the bathrooms that they're forced into if they're not able to go into the bathrooms of the gender that they identify with. We know that most women don't care about this. And we know that for trans women in prisons, that they are overwhelmingly, vastly the victims of violence and sexual assault. We know this. And so the question is, well, should we allow trans women in prisons, even if they're the worst possible people? And the answer here is, like, well, yeah, because we already have ways to be able to deal with people like that. We have places to put, like, people who pose a risk of violence or sexual assault to other people in that prison. Like, we already have that. And that's probably where she is right now. Or she's probably otherwise at like a mental health facility, right? Like, that's probably what's going to be happening with her. And it sucks because she's probably still going to be mistreated. That's the hard part about it, is that she's probably still going to be mistreated. But, like, yeah, the imposition of another law or another restriction, or rather, like, taking away the ability to be able to use, like, self-identification laws, like, putting a legal barrier in front of her from being able to get, like, access to certain, like, women's spaces, or just any trans person to be able to get access to women's spaces, but particularly with trans predators, right? You get into an issue where you are assuming that the imposition of another law is going to somehow cause these people, who were, mind you, going to commit rape, from committing rape, right? And that's just ridiculous. The imposition of another law is not going to stop someone who is going to already commit such a serious law, especially someone who has, like, a ton of mental issues, right? And all that you're going to end up doing is, like, harming trans people, right? Like, that's the thing, is that all you're doing by doing this is you're doing the same thing that people did in Silence of the Lambs. You're doing the same thing that J.K. Rowling did. You're just fear-mongering about trans people. Even if you make the argument that this person is not authentically trans, which, mind you, they seem like they are, all that you're basing that off of is that the fact that, like, even though they overwhelmingly showed, like, a vast number of the symptoms, that the doctor just happened to not believe them. I mean, what you're demonstrating is that, like, yeah, you're just kind of fear-mongering. You're doing the same thing that JK did. You're doing the same thing that people have done for centuries. And you're just kind of normalizing this idea that, like, people who otherwise you may not define as trans people, but let's be clear, like, the average person in society doesn't really draw a meaningful distinction. You're just kind of harboring hate against trans people. And continuing to spread this idea that, oh, they're rapists. And that's the problem with, like, the trans argument. I mean, like, aside from all the logical inconsistencies of, like, talking about this, aside from, like, all of the logical fallacies that we've talked about, that's probably the biggest issue, at least with me personally, because, like, I can understand having, like, like, there might be a good faith discussion in here somewhere. But I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but this isn't helping you or me or any person in the trans community. It's not. And for that, I really don't have any sympathy for you. I don't. I hope that you change. I don't anticipate it. You seem like a Blair White stan through and through. Blair White, J.K. Rowling. I don't anticipate it. No, I'm not waiting for the Rose of Dawn redemption arc. But that's the thing that sucks, is that like you try to make yourself out to be someone who's trying to help the trans community, but you're just causing us harm.